Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. March comes in like a lion, goes out like a lamb. We are getting really close to springtime, 2023. Wow. The year is moving along. We are about halfway through March, probably almost 2/3 of the way through March by the time you listen to this. Spring is among us, and lots going on, both in just the world in general, as well as the tech industry. And this is going to be kind of a slightly different Sunday Perspective show. Usually Sunday Perspectives, I'm able to kind of distill down the week, distill down a couple of different topics, try and draw a line through them, and kind of put some perspective around things. This week feels a little bit different just because it feels like there's so much going on. To a certain extent, like there's a lot going on sort of in normal life. So, on one hand, we have all these good TV shows coming out right now for their spring season. So whether you're, the end of The Last of Us or Succession or Billions or Ted Lasso or whatever it is, all these shows are coming out with their seasons are starting again. It feels like their last season. There's a lot of anticipation around those things that can get us distracted. The weather's getting better. Springtime in some parts of the world, or I guess the fall in some parts of the world, is starting up. So anytime the weather changes, I want you to get outside. You want to think less about technology. Go enjoy the world. If you're in the United States, March Madness is going on. You're hearing about brackets. You're hearing about bracket chaos, teams winning, teams losing. And it feels like every week is a little bit different. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around it. And then obviously we've got, the thing that dominated last week and what I talked about last weekend's show, kind of the brittleness, the perceived brittleness of the banking industry, not just Silicon Valley Bank, but we saw a couple of banks go under this weekend. We've seen the crypto banks go under, but we've seen some sort of non-crypto banks go under. So some concern about things like Credit Suisse and just a lot of what feels like March Madness going on right now. Like there's a lot to keep us distracted. There's a lot of sort of big news in there. And so this week was a little tougher to kind of put together a topic for Sunday Perspective. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about three topics, one having to do with AI, one having to do with security, and one having to do with kind of cloud competition that I think have some longer term ramifications. This feels a little bit like a Cloud News of the Week, but extended format. So I'm going to dive into kind of three topics after the break in which we look at some things that were announced this week or some things that were kind of discussed this week that I think could have some much bigger ramifications, in terms of what the cloud landscape is going to look like over the next 3, 4, 5 years, both from a technology perspective, how it could impact you, your job, your productivity, but also a competitive nature, and then kind of some bigger geopolitical ramifications, kind of all woven in together. So we're going to get into those three big topics right after the break. Is your cloud bill out of control? CloudZero is building a platform that will let you analyze your cloud investment faster than ever before. You'll get accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. CloudZero is how cloud-driven companies gain more financial control and predictability by driving immediate and ongoing savings. You can answer questions like, how can I save 20% of my cloud bill right now? Who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. Again, please visit cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. KubeCon and Cloud Native Con Europe 2023 is coming to Amsterdam on April 18th to 21st. The Cloud Native Computing Foundation's flagship conference gathers adopters and technologists from leading open source and cloud native communities to knowledge share as well as further the cloud native ecosystem. The conference offers in-person as well as virtual registration options. As a special offer for listeners, we're offering complimentary virtual registration. Please use the code KCEUVCCP while supplies last. We'll put that in the show notes. You don't have to remember it. That's KCEUVCCP. And we're back. And, as I mentioned, kind of a chaotic time, chaotic in the March Madness sense of, if you're in the United States, you know what March Madness is. It's the annual college basketball tournament that goes on for 3 weekends in a row. It is back-to-back basketball games all the time. Some Cinderella stories, some big wins. Everybody keeps a bracket. Sort of everybody in the country is betting on it. If you're outside of the States, think of this as like, not on the exact same level, but it's sort of like the World Cup of basketball, sort of the same sort of frenzy that the rest of the world has about the World Cup, and pods, or the play-in games, and sort of the whatever they call it, the knockout rounds and all that sort of stuff. The chaos that goes out with it. Much more upsets in the U.S. March Madness thing than we tend to see in the World Cup, but same sort of fever, same sort of thing where people are watching it all the time and being distracted at work and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, it sort of sets the tone for March, it feels like, in which there's always a little bit more chaos than maybe some other months, but we're also seeing, us transitioning from one season to the next, and obviously that has lots of interesting sort of ramifications as well. So I want to dive into 3 stories that I saw this week, not so much from a Cloud News of the Week perspective. Aaron has been doing a really good job with that lately, but 3 that I saw that really kind of got me thinking, okay, these are interesting in a big context sense. And I kind of want to weave them together to a certain extent. Some of them I might just leave alone. We might do them as follow-up shows. So the first one is, if you've been listening to the show, I think the big story of the year has really been, and the last 6 months have really been, just the amazing pace at which we're seeing, AI and AI in the context of everybody can use it, right? This 2023 feels like the year of sort of AI for everybody, as opposed to AI for data scientists or AI for headlines or whatever. This is really, whether it's ChatGPT-3, the new ChatGPT-4, all the clients that are coming out, but more importantly, the way that it's getting interwoven into the day-to-day things that just regular, everyday people, not data scientists, not super math geniuses, use. And so Microsoft had a really interesting announcement this week. It was sort of a weird announcement because it was streamed on LinkedIn, and it was sort of middle to the end of the week and that type of thing. But they showed how they were going to integrate what they're calling Copilot. It's interesting. They're using the Copilot brand that GitHub had. They're sort of integrating that now throughout the Microsoft thing. So I think we're going to hear Copilot as a brand everywhere, the same way that Office was ubiquitous everywhere. But really we're showing this Copilot AI-driven, OpenAI-driven functionality being embedded into the productivity suite. So Microsoft Office, some of the other types of tools that we see. And I think what's really interesting about it is, they're now bringing AI to the masses. And, while we've had a lot of things behind the scenes in the tools that we use, whether it's like, search, auto, kind of autocomplete and search and other sorts of things we've talked about, sort of the goalpost move a little bit. This feels like a much bigger leap. And what's really interesting about it is, it is, again, the 3rd, 4th, 5th decade of Microsoft being really relevant, and leveraging all of the investment they've made around cloud, whether it's been enough or not. People can argue that type of thing, but, really trying to be, again, in the middle of everyday workers, everyday experience, just the same way that Office was, critical to, knowledge work becoming sort of a mainstream type of thing in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s. This feels like, that happening again. And obviously Microsoft has a humongous footprint, whether you start with Bing or whether you're starting more likely with the productivity tools that you have, whether it's Teams or whatever it is. This feels very, very big. Not so much just purely from a Microsoft perspective, but when there's the opportunity to bring AI to the masses, yes, there will be people who will argue, well, what is this going to do? Is this going to get rid of a lot of jobs. I think it's going to change the nature of work. It's going to change a couple of things. Yes, there may be some jobs that get replaced because somebody can just type in some stuff in ChatGPT and you get rid of, call center workers or, inside sales workers or whatever it might be. Who knows? But I think what it really starts to do is it starts to move, spending of some of the easy to do type of things like, just go write these things to, it's going to shift people to have to be more strategic, right? So you now have this resource that, is your co-pilot, whatever it is. It's an assistant that's going to do this work, but you not only have to be strategic about what you do because now everybody has access to this resource. So you're going to get lots of people who say like, hey, ChatGPT, write me a sales email for a prospect with these services. So you're going to get a lot of sameness. So you're going to need to be creative, think strategically about how do I undo the sameness that the computer system is going to give me. But more importantly, you're also going to have domain expertise because you're going to put in some things. It's going to spit stuff out to you, and you've got to be able to figure out, that was incredibly easy, but is it correct? Is it accurate? Is it persuasive? Is it, whatever it might be? It's going to force folks to figure out domain expertise very, very quickly. And that's really interesting, right? We're going to get, things will improve, things will get better. It will make it easier for you to go, I have to crank out a couple of pages of context. Like I have a starting point, I have a template, which, for a lot of folks is like the hardest part. When you have a blank sheet of paper and you're trying to figure out how to build something. It's going to help, that low code citizen developer type of person be able to start being productive. Like, I have an idea for an application. I just don't know what the code looks like. We're starting to see some examples of like, it will write those things for you. So that's really, really exciting. I think, again, since we're bringing this to the masses, the exercise that I'm starting to do in my head, and I suggest other people consider doing it, is like, take some time, take a day, take a half a day, and really think about, how could you use these things to make your group, your organization, your team, yourself more productive, right? Don't get yourself wrapped up in the, oh my gosh, is this going to displace my job? Oh my gosh, am I going to get found out to be, an imposter or whatever? Like, but really think about like, how could I start to use this thing and start experimenting with it, right? Start thinking about the things that you do in your day-to-day life and figure out like, how could I begin to use this to save yourself 30 minutes writing that document that you are like, it's going to take me a long time. I do that repetitively. Or, we have to do these things. Maybe you're writing ad copy because you're in marketing. Maybe you're writing emails to customer prospects. Maybe you're thinking about writing some basic code. Like start experimenting with it. I think we have a tendency sometimes with technology to think about the downside of it. Is this bad? I think this is going to be an instance where you have an opportunity to be really creative with it. And you're not really sure where to start, which is perfectly fine. But the best way to start is to just sort of experiment. And again, the nice thing about this is not, it's only useful if you're a programmer. It's only useful if you have 5 or 10 years of some experience. Like this feels like something that anybody can use. And it feels like for anybody that makes an investment in it, in their time and their creativity and their experiments and their mistakes, your learning curve may be faster than other people. So it seemed like a really big deal that Microsoft was embedding this now in the stuff that is going to be used by everybody, sort of democratizing this. And I don't think we could say that 3 months ago or 6 months ago. So this feels like the beginning of something very, very big. The second thing that was on there, and this was something that Corey Quinn, who we've had on the show a number of times. A lot of people know him, as the cloud economist on Twitter and so on and so forth, writes a really interesting newsletter last week in AWS. And he brought something up in his newsletter talking about how the U.S. government, so there's an article in there about, the U.S. government is, trying to put some standards in place, some guidelines in place to ensure that the cloud is secure. And the whole reasoning for this is, obviously, the government is trying to, prevent attacks from foreign entities, bad guys, if you will. Trying to protect some of the fundamental principles of the government, in this case, democracy, from basically like propaganda and other sort of stuff in which, if you got control of the medium of communication or the systems in which people are reliant upon, you can create a lot of havoc. You can create a lot of chaos in the system. And, so they're trying to create situations in which there's stability and that they can, prevent sort of the chaos that can happen in the speed of the internet. Just like we saw the run on Silicon Valley Bank was partially driven just by the speed of the internet, the speed in which we can communicate, the speed in which information can get out there, but also misinformation, potentially false information, and just sort of chaotic type of things. They're trying to put some stuff in place. So anyways, Corey's point about this was one of the barriers that they're running into is that there are lots of known best practices to try and secure environments. Because obviously there's one thing which is like, disinformation, non-disinformation, but also if things get hacked, you can create the appearance that information which should be coming from known trusted sources is not trusted anymore. Those types of things. Also, potentially taking out critical infrastructure that you might need in order to be able to propagate good information or life-saving information, whatever it might be. And his argument was, and the government sort of highlights this as they're trying to lay out this plan for trying to make this secure, is turning on a lot of these security features is an extra cost. And so it brings up the interesting argument of if the cloud provider, if the application provider knows what good security looks like, what the best defaults should be, should those be turned on by default? And should they just come as part of the kind of the base pricing for stuff, right? So in essence, should good security just be part of everything, or should it be an extra thing? Right. So an example of this, and this is a super simplistic, maybe bad example, is like by default, an Amazon S3 bucket is, at least for a long time, I think it's been tweaked here recently, was open. It wasn't sort of locked down by default. So think of it as like it defaulted to open and freedom of access, and lots of good things could happen because it's simple to get to, and so on and so forth. It wasn't default to secure, locked down, try and avoid information being hacked and so forth. And again, there are arguments to be made on both sides of that argument, but Corey's point was, and this is kind of aligned to, where the government's kind of pushing standards is, these things have become really critical. They're no longer just sort of like nice tools to have. They're no longer just like, oh, smart builders will use these tools because it gives them agility. It's like these things have become day-to-day must-have critical infrastructure for society at large, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And should we, if there are known good ways to make those things secure, should those things be default, or should they cost extra? Because the problem of them costing extra, especially if they're optionally costing extra, is, does that dissuade people from using it because they go, oh, well, it's not in my budget, or I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this past the purchasing person, right? Like I kind of got the basic thing, but this is a 15, 20% uplift or whatever it might be. And so it does bring up a really interesting discussion of kind of two things. One, are we going to reach a point in which we look at these massive utility computing, hyperscale cloud environments as like utilities, in which we will start to see them get regulated in some way, shape, or form in terms of their stability, the same way that many countries do their utility grids, whether that's water or electric or whatever. That's one whole discussion. And the second one is, let's say they're not, which again, may very well happen the way they are today. Should critical baseline security things be on by default? And if they are, great, right? We live in a more secure type of world because people aren't all security experts. The flip side of it is, we've always seen people sort of go, well, the more security you turn on, the less I can make work by default. I'm less agile. I have to involve the security group, blah, blah, blah. And I think there's an interesting argument to be made there. I think, what we tend to find is people use security being on as an excuse for why they can't do things, as opposed to going, let me understand what you're doing. I will work around it. I will continue to make good user experiences. But I think, once we start to have a bigger conversation, a bigger context around security, reliability of things, it probably should bring us back to Should security be good security be on by default? And then how do we make teams continue to be productive when those are the new defaults or the new rules, if you will? So I think that's going to be an interesting conversation that we'll see going on here in 2023 and beyond. And then third one that I saw that was interesting, and this is something that I know I've talked to a lot of people about, industry analysts and others. I don't know that I've ever really talked about it on the podcast, which is weird because I feel like I've had this conversation like 1,000 times. But this was another article that I was reading in Corey's newsletter, in which he called it, AWS's hidden anti-competitive move is hidden in plain sight. And again, kind of forget the article title. There's a link to it in the show notes. Basically, what he says is, if you are somebody who is, building software that could be used on one of the cloud providers, so in this case, AWS. So let's say, for example, you are a company that builds a Kubernetes distribution. So let's say you're like Red Hat OpenShift, or you are a company that builds a database that involves SQL Server or something like that, whatever it might be. And you go to the market and you sell that to customers. In order for customers to use that in the best way possible, they are likely going to, want to build high availability into it. And once you start building high availability into it, you are going to most likely use multiple regions, multiple availability zones in order to be able to accomplish that. And the cost of doing that goes up because AWS not only charges the customer or the user for the compute of it, but they charge you for inter-region networking costs, right? Now, that in and of itself is fine. Where he kind of gets into this sort of anti-competitive claim is when Amazon offers a similar type of service, so RDS, for example, or EKS, as a competitive to that software version of a Kubernetes or a database or something else, in their service, when they provide high availability, they do not include the networking charges for that intra-region, inter-AZ or inter-region type of traffic. So in essence, it's network bandwidth is free when their service runs it. And I think what he highlights is something, and this is the point that I've made to a number of people, is AWS on one hand wants to get as much traffic as possible into their cloud. So they need to be partnering with lots of different software vendors and need to be open to working with open source projects and all these sort of things. But they do take advantage of the fact that they are the only ones who can control the cost of internal networking, also external networking to a certain extent. And they use that to their advantage, their competitive advantage. And whether or not that's a good thing or not, again, it's sort of debatable. I've sort of argued that they're able to compete against open source projects more effectively because they can essentially subsidize, the cost of running that software or even the software itself, because they're able to monetize based on the fact that you must be on their compute, you must be on their storage, you must be on their networking. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, it is the benefit of somebody going, well, I built all this stuff. I have the capital expenditures to building all these things. I should be able to take advantage of those as competitive differentiations. But at the same time, I want the market as much as possible to use my offering. And, so it does, I agree with Corey. It does create sort of a weird dynamic in that it's both subsidizing against open source projects or even just software as a whole when they, especially open source, when they offer the same open source as a managed service. But also the fact that they don't sort of treat cost and pricing the same way, does create some interesting things, right? So we're using AWS in this example. The same sort of example sort of applies to other clouds as well. Corey just tends to focus on AWS because obviously it's the largest. But it does create some weird dichotomy of like, am I always doing the best thing for the customer, or am I really kind of doing the best thing for AWS first and then the customer second? And again, this is one of these things in which, what tends to happen over time is the mantra of some company. So take Google's "Don't be evil," was cheered and applauded early in the days. And over time, people sort of go, okay, well, that's not really your mantra anymore. It's going to be very interesting to watch as AWS evolves, because every company, as they become larger, they have bigger target goals to meet, bigger revenue numbers to meet. They start to look for ways in which they can, start to make a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there that maybe they didn't in the past. And this is, Corey, I think highlights a really interesting thing of, what will be the perspective of AWS towards their customers, towards their partners? When is partnership good for them? When is partnership competitive for them? They're never clean cut types of things, right? They always are sort of these evolving gray areas. And this is a kind of an interesting highlighted point in which, they're taking advantage of something that they've made huge investments in. So, you don't want to necessarily waste those investments, but it is somewhat of a different perspective on, are they always doing the best thing for the customer, giving the customer the most choice? Or is this, just sort of slightly nudging towards more and more of kind of locking you into what they do, or kind of putting their thumb on the scale of which way do we want you to operate things? It's an interesting thing. It's an interesting point. And I think it's something that, again, we've talked about it for a while. It may not be completely new, but it's an interesting new discussion about the way that AWS is sort of shifting their perspective on partners and customers that maybe wouldn't have been the case 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So anyways, kind of wanted to highlight those three things. Again, sorry for the different format in this week's Sunday Perspective. I know usually we kind of try and plow through one thing and connect the dots. But this week, again, because of the sort of chaos and madness that happens in March, we get a little bit of scatterbrained Sunday Perspective. So thanks for putting up with it. Thanks for the feedback on the Silicon Valley Bank show. I saw a few people say, oh, you really should have dove into a lot of other things. Quite honestly, I feel good about that show for the most part, because we highlighted how some of these basic banking things work that I think lots of people ask us about. And quite honestly, between the time we recorded on, say, Saturday, Sunday, there was some, change in what happened. Monday, there was some change in what happened. It would have been kind of a waste of the show because so much changed in just 2 days from the specifically Silicon Valley Bank perspective. So we'll go back and put some things in the show notes about how things got resolved if people want to read about that from last week's show. But anyways, as always, we appreciate the feedback. Excited about springtime coming up, about warmer weather. Excited about a lot of really interesting guests coming up. We are, got a new batch of them. Aaron and I are booked out through May, and really excited about a bunch of guests. So thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. Like we mentioned a few weeks ago, we're coming up on the 12 millionth listen. I wish I knew exactly who it was, but really excited that we're hitting that milestone, and we're on to 13 million, 14 million, kind of hoping to keep bringing you guys really good topics, trying to learn together. And, your feedback is always welcome. So any ideas you have, feel free to send them to us, show@thecloudcast.net. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. We are getting close, hopefully, to the spring season, the pollen being done, my voice being hoarse, but thanks for putting up with it. So thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.